Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at advanced skills for creative writing, and basically these are skills that will help take your creative writing to the next level, and some things that you can look at, have a think about when you are writing your next story or the next assessment task that involves some sort of creative writing, and just think about including some of these different strategies to help sort of boost your work up a level. Now, a lot of these strategies are pretty much the ones that you would teach any young aspiring writer, not necessarily ones that are designed necessarily for work that you will be doing. However, what they do provide is they provide a number of different perspectives on writing, and they provide a number of different ways of going about how you do compose your work, and basically look at how to get your work up to that high band 6 level where obviously everyone wants to get to. So this is what we're going to be mainly looking at. And one of the first things that you'll need is you'll need metaphor and analogy. And basically, to have some metaphorical meaning or to have some figurative meaning in what you're writing essentially means that you're able to go much deeper. I'm going to highlight that word there, deeper into your narratives. And that's what you're trying to do. So when you're going deeper into your narratives, what you're showing you can do is you're showing not only can you describe things, which everyone can do, but you're showing that you are willing to actually really be involved with those ideas and actually explore them on a level where you gain some sort of insight and where the reader basically gets something out of it. But what are those things? And this is a very tough question, which often gets asked. And basically, how do you do this? Well, metaphor basically is something which is used to represent something else. And so this is what you're basically looking at it as, is that you can represent things in the way that they actually are, or you can represent them as something else, something that probably more fits what their personality, what they look like, or give a better account for what that thing is or what that person is than just simply stating who they are and what they are. For instance, if I was to say, I was to describe a car to you, but instead of describing as a car, I was describing as a tiger because it's a lot like a tiger in so many ways, then that's a metaphorical way of approaching a car. Because if I imagine a car, you could imagine a number of different things. If I imagine a car like a tiger, I think of something fierce and predatorial and tough and able to race long distances and really fierce and those sorts of things. And it starts to get more of a personality and more of an image going, which more represents something like, if you're comparing a car to a tiger, it's probably going to be something like a sports car, something with a bit of guts behind it. So that helps to better represent that object, that image, rather than just saying, oh, it's a car, because that doesn't really represent much at all. The other thing you can use is analogy, which is basically a continuation of a metaphor. Now, what I'll explain it as being is that an analogy basically continues on that initial metaphor that you may have used. Now, of course, you would refer to both of these things as metaphor, and they both are metaphors, but an analogy is more of a way of saying that we're making a number of different comparisons between this, and it's between two objects. So for that car and tiger example I mentioned before, it continues on with that image. It continues to represent the car as a tiger. It doesn't even represent it as a car by the end. It's representing it entirely as a beast, as it is. So that's one thing you look at. So rub that off, and basically what metaphor and analogy are, they're both forms of figurative languages, and they both basically refer to things called intangibles. Now, intangibles essentially means what this image does, which is that it's something that you can't see. It's something that you can't touch, feel, smell, or anything else like that. It's an idea rather than something that's physical and actually real. Now, if you're going back to the example I mentioned before about the car and tiger, well, you're saying, well, tigers are real and cars are real, so they're both not intangibles. How's that figurative? Well, the reason for that is because we're saying the car is not literally a tiger, and that's where the figurativeness comes in. So it's representing it as the idea of it being like that, rather than necessarily actually being that. Of course, generally when you refer to figurative devices and figurative language, you're looking at ideas such as freedom, such as emotions, such as love and hate. You're looking at different sorts of ways of thinking, spirits and those sorts of things, which you can't literally see, touch, taste, or do anything where you can actually physically interact with them. and yet are still there. They're still present, and they're still sort of things that you can describe in some way. And of course, you can use a non-figurative or a literal object to describe an idea. So for instance, if you're describing freedom, then you might describe it as a bird. So the bird is freedom. And it just basically, because it sums up a number of the ideas which is related to freedom. So this is what you're looking at when you're looking at figurative devices. And basically, you can attach these sorts of things to a metaphorical idea or basically a literal construct. Okay, and we call them figurative, as I said, because they're referring to things which are not literal, as in, we're not literally saying, like that example before, that the car is like a tiger, or the car is like a tiger literally. It's just that when we imagine it, we sort of imagine something that puts the two together. Alright, so that's easy enough. And I'll rub this off again, and we'll move on. Okay, now what can you use metaphors to do? What sort of effect do they create? Well, this is basically, we're just going to go over a very quick checklist of the sorts of effects that metaphors create. So you know what you're actually looking for or looking to try and do when you're using them. Because using metaphors is all well and good, and certainly it helps you get deeper, but you need to make sure it's in relation to something. And certainly you need to make sure that your abstractness needs to sort of, when you're talking about ideas that are figurative and not necessarily things you can see and touch, that you're talking about them for a reason. There's a good reason that you're discussing them, and particularly in depth. For instance, if you're describing something about the theatre of war and then you mention a big long thing about love, that's got to have a connection to the theatre of war part. It just can't go there on its own. It needs to have something to do with the rest of the story. Otherwise, it's going to be meaningless and people are going to go, why is it there? So these are some reasons why you would use them. First of all, you help to create an image. So as I mentioned with that example, I won't go into it again, but it helps to create an image in our minds that we can sort of go, oh yeah, that goes together with that. That's the first one. The second one is it adds a bit of personality to it, and certainly you want to have writing with a little bit of personality and use those sorts of images to create not only personality in terms of the things that are in the story, but your own personality, as in you come up with your own sort of weird and wicked metaphors and different ideas that basically say that I'm not going to write like everyone else does, I think my own way. Yes, it is about individuality and being unique and all that, but really it's about just adding a little bit more than just they did this and it was like this and it was like that, and yeah, blah, blah, blah. It gets very boring if you do it that way. If you add a bit of personality, if you add something that's a bit more you, it certainly comes across a lot better. It creates an atmosphere or mood, and certainly with a lot of different kinds of metaphorical imagery, you can really write in a way which sort of sets a certain atmosphere up, and certainly gets people really engaged with that, or basically what goes on in the story. So creating an atmosphere or mood is always something you're trying to do, and trying to make people feel something, and this is what this is used for. Stimulating senses, again, this is related to that as well, in that you can use it to sort of make something that's fairly lifeless really come to life a bit more, and you do this basically through stimulating the senses. You develop extra meaning with metaphor, and now this is the complicated one, because okay, all metaphors will have an extra meaning because they are referring to something as something else. But the one thing about creating extra meaning is you need to sort of go, why am I doing it? And what possible meaning could this be suggesting? Now, that's not necessarily the role of the author to say that it could mean this, it could mean that. But just think about having some things where the meaning may be a little bit open. And that allows the reader to sort of engage a little bit with your story, as in they've got a little puzzle to solve. They've got this sort of thing to go, oh, this could actually mean this as well. And it's not just something that we literally go, oh, well, it just means that because he says right there, it's what happens. But creating a little bit of vagueness or creating possible double meanings really helps your work to stand out, and certainly means that you can represent a theme in a multitude of ways. Now, you might be saying, oh, if the metaphor makes things a little bit unclear, how does that help my theme? Well, in short, basically what you're doing by doing that is you are connecting certain things together, and you may not necessarily be doing it in a way that you're making the meaning completely obscure, but you're changing something which probably wasn't a direct link to your idea. So for instance, if you're doing an idea of change, your metaphor could actually be basically an image which you're linking to that idea through its double meaning, its extra meaning. So that's essentially what you'll be using these for mostly, is actually channeling it so it doesn't just have an ordinary extra meaning, it goes back to your main idea, and you don't have to necessarily talk about really literal and obvious things. I mean, those sorts of responses don't go very, very highly, whereas ones which actually get there through a double or a third meaning, probably not a third so much, but a double meaning definitely really do come across quite much better anyway. They develop association or idea, and this again is linked to this extra meaning, where basically your association to an idea is created through constructing it, and basically to show that it's like this because it comes across that way. So a child and a teddy bear don't go together as anything really until you sort of start to layer other things onto it, and then the bear really starts to take a significance as childhood, and that's where the extra meaning is. And if you're writing something about childhood and using a teddy bear, well, it's not necessarily childhood unless it becomes part of someone being a child, and that's when that double meaning comes in. And finally, reinforces a theme, and again, this goes with pretty much all of these things actually, because your theme is your main idea, and essentially by doing all these things, you're cementing your main idea, developing it, and making sure it does stand the test. And certainly, you want to be creating these sorts of images and metaphors because, and the thing is, if you do them, they will be found out, and you don't have to necessarily worry about, oh, will someone get it? They will come across, and they'll usually come across every time. So make sure that you can experiment with these things and not have to worry about, well, does this make my idea come across? Because if you make enough of a link to it, then it will come across. Okay, now basically metaphors are made by this, essentially finding similarities between two things or imagining what they might resemble. So essentially it's about you making connection between things and not saying that this person's like this person, but saying this person's like this thing, this person, this animal, this whatever it may be. Imagining what they might resemble sort of helps to create an image. And if I was to describe someone to you, if I was to say they had red hair, blue eyes, or if I said they look like a fox, that gets a much quicker image in my head, and certainly is much more efficient for the reader to get than if you just describe someone with red hair and blue eyes. Because what they're doing is, again, red hair and blue eyes is fairly vague. A lot of people have red hair and blue eyes. Whereas if you say they look like a fox, well, maybe a lot of people look like foxes as well. But it gets the image across much quicker. And then you start to associate bits of their personality with them as well. Seeing as foxes are generally considered to be a bit sneaky, they're considered to be predators and all these sorts of things. So by putting those things together, you're not only just getting the image and what they look like, but you're getting some characteristics as well. So finding those similarities are things that help. And they're the simplest way to think about if you're not sure about how to create your own metaphors, is find two things that are similar and make them your metaphor. In other words, and this is an example right here, if you've got a hand like a claw, then just describe it as a claw. Just say the hand is a claw. And you can pretty much describe it as in his claw clutched at the object, whatever it may be. So if it looks like it, just basically write it as is. You don't have to fiddle around with it or think about it and go, oh, how does that work? You can basically just put two and two together, and that's not an issue. Okay, so you don't, as I said, you don't have to worry about whether or not they go together literally, because, as I said, it's about imagination and showing that imagination is essentially that, is by putting those things together, you are showing that you have the capacity to be imaginative, and you can find these similarities, which allows you to go into sort of deeper meanings. And as I said, good metaphors are insightful. They move away from the cliched ones. Now, this is an interesting point right here, and I'll just sort of crab across this now. You can have cliched metaphors, and you can have cliched representations of other things. For instance, I just made one then when I said I crab across, which is the classic one for if I walk sideways towards something, then it's basically I'm doing the whole crab walk thing. You can think of other ways to represent that. And basically that allows your writing to be a little bit more fresh. It certainly makes it stand out. And if you're not saying, oh, crawl like a crab, or I know that's a simile, but basically to put those two things together may not be necessarily too imaginative until you think about the ways in which you're doing it. You may compare someone to a crab because simply their two fingers are almost vice-like in their grip or something else like that. They're not done too often, so you can get away with them. And even better ones are ones which basically take works from classic times or history, or basically make other references. So for instance, a lot of poetry you might read has a lot of references to Latin, to ancient Greece, to ancient Rome, all of these different things. And basically those references not only sort of show a bit of intelligence on their part, but they also tell another story. And that if you're saying that it's like the fall of Troy, then it almost basically brings the story of Troy into your story. And essentially it almost mirrors two different images, and certainly allows a lot of interpretation, because people will start guessing, well, how's it like Troy? Is it like Troy because it was a 10-year battle, or is it like Troy because it ended with a horse going in and slaughtering everyone and it was a big blunder, or whatever it may be? And it asks all those different questions. So again, it adds a layer and helps to create definitely a lot of insight there. So it basically gives you a number of different ideas. And again, here's another example. Having a flock of birds being like bombers or fighter jets or something along those lines. I mean, comparing them to World War II fighter bombers certainly shows a bit of insight. Certainly shows that you know your history as well, or know a little bits and pieces about history. And basically, it does show intelligence off a lot more if you start to reference these sorts of things. Now, these are very simple comparisons to make, and certainly the way that they fly are quite similar, and you can make those distinctions. But basically, find things which have a sort of a deeper meaning or a deeper significance. I mean, they do vary story to story, and certainly this sort of image would only go together in a certain kind of story. If you're writing about why they need to be protected, you wouldn't be comparing them to fighter bombers, because fighter bombers, well, the idea is you shoot them out of the sky. It's not necessarily that they stay in the air. So probably not a good one to put together. Whereas if it's one about duck shooting, then yeah, you may compare them to that. So it just depends what image it goes with and how it goes together. All right. Now, analogies. And we touched on this earlier, that is a continued reference made towards something turns a metaphor into an analogy. Now, a simple way of representing an analogy is through Batman. Now, Batman is an analogy because he makes not only, or he's not only a Batman, but there's a continued reference between the bat and the man and the sort of characteristics. So, if you look at the cape, you look at the ears, you look at hiding in the shadows, all the rest, it's essentially a long-running metaphor. Now, putting this in perspective for what you can use, you sort of think of it that way, as you can continue to make metaphorical links between one thing and another. So in this case, a man and a bat. In other cases, whatever it is that you're putting together and you're trying to represent that person as. Now, obviously the idea is to avoid the really cliched ones, but it is the principle that you really need to look at. And certainly, it's a nice little sort of visual to keep in your mind when you're trying to work out how to use analogies, is basically just think of Batman. What would Batman do? And it allows you basically to associate the qualities, as I said, of one thing onto another. So, it reinforces their symbolic value as well. Now, you might be wondering why those two images are there. Well, this is an example. Is if you want to represent a character as a scavenger, then you would basically link it to something else, which is a scavenger. That's a very easy reference. Vulture, okay, it's been done 1,000 times, but you can still do it. Or a hyena as well. One probably is not done quite as often, but they're the two probably most common examples if you want to represent someone as being a scavenger or basically a sort of low being who resorts to picking at the dead. Then those two, and particularly in a lot of texts, those two animals immediately come to mind for someone who is a scavenger or that kind of character. So it's essentially, it's a very simple and a very neat way of representing those things without just saying, oh, he's a scavenger, because it doesn't really represent their personality until you sort of throw those other elements into it. So, In summary, these are the sorts of things you need to do to add a little bit of extra metaphorical and extra meaning onto your work. First of all, you need to find metaphors which connect similar things. So find some things that you can put together and link them. You develop deeper meaning. Find something where you can actually have a bit of layered meaning. Certainly think about what it is. Actually do think about it. Don't just go, oh, I'm just going to write it and get it out of the way. Think about it a little bit. I mean, it's part of the fun is creating puzzles for other people to solve. And certainly it may actually help you enjoy your writing a little bit more if you think about it that way. And finally, use analogies to build a greater effect. As in, once you've got a metaphor in mind, if you want to continue it, go for it. I mean, continue to really build on it and strengthen it so people get that image in their mind when they're reading it. It certainly will help your work. And certainly, as I mentioned with all of these things, by creating this extra layered meaning, it means that you don't have to resort to more direct channels to be able to represent your ideas and particularly your themes. So if you're one of those people who struggles with writing a theme-based story, or you get basically pulled up for saying that this is too close to the theme and that you're representing it too literally, then these are the things that you need to be looking at. But otherwise, that's about it. So until next time, I'll see you later.